This source introduction is going to cover the work of Bonnie Smith in relation to the case study Napoleon. It'll focus a little on the influence on France and Europe debate, but I'll also show you how it could be used in the context of the extent of Napoleonic reform debate as well. I think she's highly relevant for both of those specific debates about Napoleon. Let's just quickly, before we get into this, remind ourselves of what really question 2 is asking us. And it's looking, generally, it's asking us to look at how approaches, or how interpretations, I should say, have changed over time. So it's asking us to think about why it is that approaches to, say, Napoleonic history have moved and changed over the course of the last couple of hundred years. So it's asking us to think about things like the availability of sources, how the context of historians shape their interpretations, how they construct history and how that affects their interpretation of Napoleon potentially, and also how the changing philosophies of history have been part of this. There's also other factors you might be able to draw upon depending on what your debate is and so on, but these are at least a really good start. And remember, this is a detail we're trying to get for each of the historians that we study. Okay, so it doesn't have to be exactly the same for each historian, but you need to be aware of a range of these different factors in terms of what's shaping their history. And this is just coming from page 12 and 13 of the syllabus. I've said in other videos as well that I think it's important that with the exam, with Napoleon, you cover some of the breadth. And I've suggested, if you go back and have a look, there's probably about 4 phases to Napoleonic historiography that might be a useful introduction. I don't think that's a watertight categorization, but I just think it's a helpful way to begin to think about what's happened to Napoleonic history over time in some kind of neat introductory manner. I've also suggested that in the exam, so you want to represent some of that breadth. And I've also suggested as well that I think you also need to pick on a range of different works that are going to help you explain how Napoleonic interpretations of Napoleon have changed over time. So if the metaphor is that if each of these yellow dots was an interpretation of Napoleon, there's just hundreds of them, thousands of them probably actually, then what we're doing is picking on a few of them to try and highlight how the debate has actually changed. So you're representing, I should say, both the whole of the debate and also the parts in depth. Now, where do we get the? So we get the breadth from covering a range of different histories over time. It would be a pretty bad approach to just get stuck here looking at histories that were written between 1799 and 1840. That's not going to do you any favor. They do expect you to be writing about recent historiography, so it's incredibly important that I think you get at least, I think, probably one source from each period. That would be a really good start. How do you get the depth then when you look at some of these in more detail? Well, this is where your notes and your research into each of the historians come in, and you should be able to draw on their identity, their context. You should be able to discuss their aims and purposes. You should be able to discuss how they worked and so on, okay, to analyze and evaluate their work and their interpretation in the context of this debate. So let's do that with Bonnie Smith. Some biographical details looking at her personal information. Generally speaking, she's an academic historian. She's a professor at Rutgers University in the United States. She's worked there, I think, from about 1990 through to, if not the present day, she was certainly working there in about 2015. So all the sources that I saw said that she was still there then. So that's quite a long career at that university. She's written a number of books and articles. So these include, this is a popular one, The Gender of History, so Men, Women and the Practice of History, more like a historical theory, fairly recent book. Women in World History, she was actually the editor of a large edited several volumes that look at women in world history. So she's been at the forefront of issues of women and gender and so on, and how that relates to the historical practice. Her personal interests in terms of research obviously relate to that. So women and gender, the idea of world history, and how they all kind of mix. And you could probably add into that she's interested also in, say, the idea of historical theory and historical method. That's pretty evident from this book here. So this is the Oxford Encyclopedia I was talking about that she was the editor of. You can see several volumes published in 2008. So she's quite active still, or at least very recently she was very active still. The book that we're going to concentrate on here though is this one, Changing Lives, Women in European History Since 1700 by Bonnie Smith. So this was published in 1989, so it's a little older. But I think I've selected this for a reason, and that is that there are other contemporary debates and sources that I think reveal what's happening to the debate and that's fresh in the debate about Napoleon. And I think this represents a closer, I guess, example of how feminist history began to affect Napoleonic history towards the latter part of the 20th century. So I've intentionally selected a book that isn't super recent for this purpose. So it fits generally, this Changing Lives book fits generally into this period that we're talking about in terms of when history as a professional sort of discourse, a professional process was challenged and fragmented. And part of the fragmentation of this was that even professionals themselves began to challenge their own view of how history should be done. A good example of this is the rise of feminist history, who are challenging the older men who essentially men who had dominated the field for many years. So an important part of the story of history's fragmentation was that it actually was internally divided for a number of years, and has maybe perhaps always been that way. But you think of the rise of things like the Annales school, you think of Marxist historians, you can think of feminist historians, you can think of all of the types of history from below, micro historians. There were professional historians who were arguing and clamoring essentially over a different vision for how their profession should work. And Bonnie Smith was part of that general process. So I think that's an important part, to put her in the context of the opening up of history. She was an important part of this. So the context that's part of the context. But also if we think more specifically about the book Changing Lives and Bonnie Smith's work in general, there's a few more specific things we could say. One is that they are good evidence of part of the context of the rise and increasing influence of social history. So from the 1960s, particularly, maybe even before that, but certainly the 1960s represented a change in how many historians began to work. They began to look far less at the elite groups in society, the big movers and shakers, the great men of history and so on, and they began to look in a very wide sort of ranging interpretations of how different groups in society were influenced by history and also influenced history. So there are many examples before the 1960s of this, but this is probably when it became really popular. In fact, you could even say that it kind of began to be dominant from the 1960s on. And this is an interesting example of that. So this history from below, how did regular people interact with big historical movements? So Bonnie Smith's part of that. This book is kind of an expression of, partly anyway, an expression of that. I think it's also important to note that many of these historians were, in a sense, experimenting with new methods of history. So instead of, say, many of the older historians reading official documents and thinking about those sources and what they revealed about the past, many of these historians have gone back and reread those sources for what they actually assumed about the world, the values they had, and what they might actually tell us about the average person in those periods of history. So court documents, official government records, and so on. Part of social history has been the expansion of source material, getting letters and diaries of the average person, but part of it has been working with old sources in new ways. So new methodology is important here, and that's going to come out in Bonnie Smith's work. Also, I think there was an increasing acceptance, or at least challenge in this period, the second half of the 20th century, that the professionalized version of history had essentially been dominated by and for men. Most of the academics working in universities and most of the academics publishing material were men. And the claim was that they were writing essentially male-dominated topics and interested in male-dominated things. So you think of military and political history, often that reflected the values of many men in society, rather than thinking about the women in society. And in fact, an important change in military history in the 20th century was that it began to reflect the impact of war and so on women far more increasingly. It's also important to place this in the context by pointing out that at the same time people were beginning to point out the oversight of many historians in writing about women's issues, another part of this was that just the general fact that many more women were actually entering and succeeding in higher education. So this was something that not many women had gone to, say, university before this period. This wasn't a kind of a common thing that women were encouraged to do. But they increasingly were encouraged to do that. I think that sounds strange in today's world, But the expanding place of women had many implications for history. So there were new interests. Women's issues were part of what should be researched, according to these women, and many men agreed and got on board with that. Some still resist. There are new insights as a result, and also new concerns that were raised as a result of all of this. In terms of the aims and purposes of this book, Changing Lives, what can we say about it? Well, it's obviously an attempt, to examine the role of women. So it's an attempt to examine the role of women in European history, but I think it's also important to point out here that the focus is not necessarily on the elite women, the royals and the people who actually made up the higher society. Bonnie Smith's particularly interested in trying to figure out how ordinary women experienced big issues in European history, since 1700. So that's an important part of it. She's aiming to rewrite women and their experiences back into our understanding of the past, particularly in this context of Europe. The book is a textbook aimed at introducing these issues to higher education audience, so it's basically a uni text. It's not overly complex, and what I mean by that is because it's a textbook and an introduction, it's not. It's designed to actually draw people into the topic rather than exhaust the topic. Okay, so that's part of the point as well, is that this is not a book about Napoleonic reform and its relation to women. That only forms one part of the book. The book generally challenges the notion, as well, or aims to challenge the notion that women experienced historical events in the same way. And this is an important part of her work. She's not saying women as a general class experienced this. She's saying this is how a variety of women experience these issues. So that's important. She's highlighting to the audience that just as men experience many different periods of history differently, so did women. And she's trying to draw out the diversity there. And I think part of that means that she can contextualize the experience of women in Europe since that period and maybe for the present day. Why are there debates? Why are there issues? Why are there perhaps ongoing concerns? Well, this book can actually maybe help to contextualize some of that. So in terms of the construction of history, how does she go about this? Well, it's a constructionist view of the past. So essentially what that means is that Bonnie Smith is working with empirical information, but she's infusing that with theory and contemporary concerns, to produce new interpretations. A theory, simply what she might be working with here is gender theory, the idea that the world is partly shaped by how we gender things, so women's issues versus men's issues and so on. So she's using historical artifacts and documents, but she's also working with ideas from the contemporary world. A big part of how she comes to her interpretation is not necessarily by going out and trying to find a stack of new evidence, although she does that. In terms of her writing of the section that relates to Napoleon, a big part of what she's doing is the rereading of old sources that we talked about before. So, for example, she takes the Code Napoleon from 1804, and she claims, she basically looks at how many people would argue that the Code was a great example of Napoleon's attempt to reform France and Europe into a very modern, enlightened state. And people who essentially argue in favor of Napoleon and suggest that he had a good impact on Europe and was, essentially creating a new society, they would argue that that's one of the best examples of his modernizing mission. Now, she's reading the same document, the Code, and asking questions about what it assumes about gender and what does it reveal about the experiences of women. What did it mean for women? So she's rereading that document for this idea and asking the question, does it really suggest that Napoleon built an empire based upon liberty, equality, and fraternity, or something else? There's also, it's important to note that part of the story is that she also looks at new source material to highlight the experience. She doesn't assume because the Code says this, therefore this must have happened. She also looks for evidence of it actually happening. So that's part of it as well. So new source material is part of the construction of history here. And remember, because this is not a book about Napoleon, the point isn't to go and find a whole bunch of new sources, but to find some that seem to align with this general view or perhaps challenge it. So a couple of other points I think that are important to make here. One, the final point I should say is that the work is extremely analytical, and by that I mean that it's not the kind of sort of rabidly opinionated work that we've seen by some people like Madame de Staël or Chateaubriand when they talk about Napoleon. they really have developed a polemic that is essentially out to attack Napoleon more because of his character than anything sort of analytical. So this is different. It's criticizing Napoleon, but it's doing it on the basis of some fairly intellectual analysis of sources and thinking about how the world might or should work. So that's another part of the construction of history, is it's analytical, and there it can be contrasted, I think, to other things. Okay, so based upon all of this, what does she actually say about Napoleon and what he was up to in this period? Well, she is overtly challenging the view that Napoleon brought about liberalizing reform to France. And basically, she argues that many elements of the code actually limited and restricted the lives of women rather than made them more free. Okay, so what she's arguing is that although many people have seen the Napoleonic Code as quite progressive, and she might suggest in some ways it was, yeah, sure, but there were clear limits to that. And she suggests that it's probably not helpful, therefore, to see Napoleon as 100% promoting this idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. There were clear limitations and blind spots to this, and some that were actually quite negative. She goes beyond that and argues that his impact on women, at least in France and Europe, was actually to institutionalize disadvantage and even exploitation. So rather than Napoleon being, about all this idea about being all for liberty, she's suggesting that actually he was for liberty in certain ways, but actually overlooked it in many other areas. In fact, he not only did not promote the liberty of women, but actually constrained much of their behavior. So she says this is a quote from the actual book. The code reduced, if not eliminated, male accountability for sexual acts and thrust it squarely on women. There's an unfair sense of how the legal code worked. We'll look at an example in a second. She also adds that the Napoleonic Code influenced many legal systems in Europe and the New World, that is America, and set the terms for the treatment of women on a widespread basis, establishing male power by transferring autonomy and economic goods from women to men. The code organized gender roles for more than a century. So she's arguing that it actually had a long-term impact on women as well, and it was quite detrimental. What does she actually say about the code? What kinds of things can she say to draw this conclusion? Well, her reading of the code brings up a couple of important points. One is that in the code, women actually were not allowed to initiate lawsuits. Okay, so there's lots of reform going on in terms of the legal code in France and across Europe where the code was implemented, but one of the absent points was that women weren't actually allowed to start lawsuits. Okay, so that's a clear disadvantage. They're also actually they weren't allowed to be called upon as witnesses in legal cases. So there were many restrictions on what they could actually achieve legally in Napoleon's empire. Secondly, she actually shows that the code provided little to no legal control over property for women. What that means essentially is that men had all of the legal rights to property, so land and so on. That means a woman couldn't go and buy and sell property in the same way that men could. And that for her suggested there were obvious limitations on what how much a woman could be independent. If their property was tied to men, then that meant they had to have a man, in a sense, in the picture to actually have property. So that meant that many women couldn't actually develop their own economic freedom. And there's another good example of how the code disadvantaged women. The third and final example, there are more, she presents many more, but this is just another one. She points out that the laws addressing women, this should be rephrased, but the point is that many of the laws in the code addressed elements of women's sexual behavior. So they were and were not allowed to do certain things sexually. But almost these were absent for men. So again, that sense of two different, a double standard essentially, that women were prevented from doing certain things, and if they did them, could actually be taken to court, but if men did them, nothing really happened to them, or it was hard to actually do anything about it. So again, the idea that men were privileged under the code is the conclusion that she draws. Okay, some quick evaluations of the source. It's good evidence of the fragmentation, so we've established that. Daniel Wolfe, Global History of History, 2014, says that the last basically 50 to 80 years, history has undergone fragmentation. So it's a good example of that and shows how that has led to new readings of the past. I think it's also an important point, Bonnie Smith's conclusion, to raise this idea that history doesn't always require new evidence to develop new interpretations. In this case, ideology and theory, feminism and gender, have been an important part of inspiring Bonnie Smith to go back and look at a text through a different lens. And doing so means that no new source material may be required to begin developing a new interpretation. And that's part of what's happened here. And also I think it's important to point out that Bonnie Smith's conclusion is fundamentally opposed to people like Emmanuel de las Casas. Okay, de las Casas was one of the classic, basically developing his work in conjunction with Napoleon, developed the conclusion that Napoleon had destroyed the ancient regime, had liberalized France, developed a new society, brought order out of chaos in Europe and so on. She's arguing that that's a limited view. And basically, it might have helped, Napoleon's rule might have helped certain people in society, but in her view, it certainly didn't benefit women in a large kind of view. So that's part of the problem. I think it's also important to point out a couple of things here, and that is that she's drawing similar conclusions to someone like Lefebvre, so the Marxist, the French Marxist. He argued that there were clear limitations to Napoleonic reform too, but he wasn't arguing it just in terms of women, but arguing it in terms of the general labouring classes, the proletariat and the peasants in Napoleonic France and Europe. So that's two kind of historians who are focused on social history, who are arguing that there were severe limitations to Napoleonic reform, and also arguing that his impact in the process was therefore negative. I think it's also important to distinguish it though. Just because she's concluding that Napoleon's rule was essentially negative, or at least was had very negative consequences for certain groups, that doesn't mean she's writing Napoleon off as an evil character like someone like de Stael or Chateaubriand does. So here it's important to point out that just because a historian might criticize parts of Napoleon and his rule, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily thinking that Napoleon is an evil person. And that's an important distinction. Her work is analytical and it's scholarly, it's not polemic. I think that's an important distinction. Okay, final thing that I want to quickly cover here is that is asked the question, what kinds of debates is it relevant for Bonnie Smith? Well, certainly the impact on France and Europe debate. She's arguing that Napoleon's rule basically entrenched misogyny and also contributed to the general subjugation of women in both the short and long terms. Her approach to this is interesting, and that would give you interesting evidence, I think, to work with if you're trying to explain the changes in interpretations. Why have people read Napoleon's impact differently? Well, part of it is because of ideology and method. She has brought to the table a different ideology and a different method, and that has helped to expand the debate into new areas. I think second one that's obvious to me is the extent of Napoleonic reform. If you're engaging with that debate, which is basically about how much reform Napoleon actually brought to France and Europe, then this is weighing in on that debate as well. Smith is actually arguing that the reforms had severe limitations. That is, that they really didn't do much for the life of women, and they really didn't thoroughly address the issues of women in that context. So the claim that Napoleon somehow modernized France and Europe is to some degree perhaps true, because there were things that he brought to the picture that certainly challenged the older regimes. But in her view, it's also true to say that there were clear limitations and a clear unevenness to the way that this actually worked. So I think Bonnie Smith's a good source because she allows you to talk about a few different debates, and her method and the way she constructed history is interesting, and that would give you a good opportunity to discuss her as a source in quite a lot of detail.